Hi, Nitin. Can you see us, hear
I can
us?
I can hear you very well. I can probably see it's a
So
lot
maybe
of
we should explain who is around the table, maybe, while we wait for Martina. You want to do that quickly? Yep. So we're a subgroup of the group, in fact, because it's the real end of the meeting where we're supposed to define actions and next steps.
right.
So very briefly, so that they know who is around the table. Janet, you want to?
I'm Janet Cunningham. I'm a psychiatrist in Uppsala, interested in immunopsychiatry. Nice to meet you guys.
Nice to meet you too.
Hey y'all, Andy Miller from Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm a psychiatrist, physician scientist, and I work on the effects of inflammation on the brain.
I am Femke Laarmers. I'm from Amsterdam University Medical Center. I'm a researcher focusing on inflammatory phenotypes of depression.
Nice to meet you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Manish Jha. I'm a psychiatrist by training and focusing on developing new treatments for mood disorders, but also substance use disorders.
Right.
Southwest.
UT Southwestern in Dallas, Texas.
Hi everyone, I'm Annelie Lind. I am lead of neuroscience at Olink Proteomics, and we work with proteomics for precision medicine. I'm very interested in the psychiatric field.
Nice to meet you.
I'm Courtney Worrell. I'm a trial manager and PhD student at King's College London.
Hello everyone, I'm Giulia Lombardo and I am a postdoc. I work at King's College with Professor Briante, and my interest is in neuropsychiatry and sex differences in this field.
Hi everyone, I'm also part of the King's College team. I'm a psychiatrist by training and postdoctoral research.
Hello, Marion Boyer. I'm the French psychiatrist of the group. So coming from the University of Paris, I'm one of the hosts of this meeting, which was co-organized by a non-profit foundation called Fondation FondaMental, and with the support of a very big project funded by the French government to develop precision psychiatry. And we had 3 fantastic days, 2.5, in fact, where we heard a lot of people coming from different fields and different angles on precision psychiatry, coming from academia, industry, policymakers, regulators, who am I forgetting, industry. And we also started the meeting with 2 keynotes given by really key people, one on oncology, to try to understand where they are and how precision medicine helped them to define new treatments and new targets. And the same for the field of Alzheimer, where we listened to a neurologist from Amsterdam who explained all the development of biomarkers and how it ends up at FDA with a purely biological diagnosis now for Alzheimer. So that was the starting point. We're waiting for 2 colleagues who are finishing. Mm-hmm. We're waiting for Martin Cass, who is the president of ECNP, and Brenda Penix, who is a specialist of immunometabolism, which was one of the subgroup described. So just to quickly summarize how the program was organized, but I think you've seen it. We had the first half day where we described the successes from, but that's not the idea. I'm just talking, no, that's another stuff. Just describing how we organized the 3 days. So we launched the meeting with Andy to explain lessons learned from the past, what is the definition in precision psychiatry, and what are some of the successes in terms of dimensions and discoveries of dimensions. Then the second day, which was extremely busy, was divided into several parts. The morning was where we listened to our friends, oncologists and neurologists, to learn how they discovered all the tools they have developed for precision medicine. Then we had a few examples coming from the field of immunopsychiatry, but also brain imaging, biotherapy, and digital biomarkers to explain successes in precision psychiatry. Then what did we do? Somebody has the program? So I already forget. Well, then we listened to, we had the afternoon on tools to develop precision psychiatry, in particular artificial intelligence, how to build multimodal databases, and basically how we could use machine learning, artificial intelligence, once we have created these large multimodal databases. And this morning was devoted to the way forward. And we heard industry explaining strategies for drug development. So how can we accelerate innovation? What are the strategies to design precise clinical program? How can we again use data and build real-world data to develop drugs? And we ended the morning with the patient's perspective. We heard the president of a very large European association, which is called Gamian. And we had the vision of, I think Bruce Cuthbert is still with us. He explained where RDoc, discussed RDoc and its implication in precision psychiatry. And so now the goal of this meeting this afternoon is really to describe or define how we can move the field forward, what are the next steps, and what we should do to help. So I wrote this slide like 2 minutes before lunch, 30 minutes ago, just to give you an overview of the summary, in fact, of what I wanted to share with you. So on the left, I listed the good news about the field, and on the right, I listed the but points so that we could discuss the but. So the good news is that I think we can follow the examples from other fields and I think listen to lessons on what they have not well done. And I think we could learn a lot from that. Second, we really are now convinced, and we heard lots of them. I forgot to mention Olink and proteomics. In the tools we have lots of technologies that could enable us to do some good deep phenotyping of large cohorts. So, of course, for the biological markers, but also for the brain imaging, for the digital tools. We also know how to build multimodal databases. I'm not so sure we know how to use artificial intelligence and machine learning, but by the time we have constructed these databases, maybe this will have made progress. We know that we already have successes with demonstrating the capacity we have to identify dimensions which cut across disorders, are underlined or associated with precise biomarkers and mechanisms for some of them. Also biomarkers to identify subgroups and possibly new treatments for mechanism-based hypotheses. We've also learned this morning that we have lots of new drugs in the pipe, increased investments. So that was good news coming both from big and small companies. And we also listen to patients saying that they are ready to co-create and participate to research projects. But there is a but, or several buts. First, we do realize, I think it was clear for us, but I think this is a big question mark. We don't have tumors and we don't have biomarkers like beta amyloid in neurodegenerative disorders, except for antibodies. But apart from that, we still don't have biomarkers. Second, if there are new drugs and increased investment to develop new drugs, the number of drugs validated by FDA, not to mention EMA, has not increased. We need to collaborate to make a good use of all the data we have, but we are not to the point of having common and shared data, endpoints, common denominators to assess patients. And this, I think, is a big gap. And the fourth point, which was the end of this morning, which was a bit sad, I must say, is that the regulators, agencies, policymakers are not listening to us, I think. They're not following precision psychiatry, and very often they're not coming to the meeting, because this meeting, in fact, the goal of this meeting, which follows a similar meeting which was organized a year ago, this one really aimed at having stakeholders from different areas and domains with us. And we wanted really to share results and challenges with them, but they're not coming. So it's difficult because the explanation of what the EMA describes this morning is basically that if we find dimensions, they have to be specific to a disorder, which is exactly not what we want to do. And we kept explaining that again and again. So we have a problem. Maybe they don't listen, they don't hear, I don't know. Qualitative problems.
Huge disconnect between what Bruce Cuthbert is talking about at the NIH and what the regulatory agencies are looking at. the idea of a transdiagnostic construct that cuts across disorders is not something that it appears that the regulatory agencies, at least the EMA, has much of an appetite for. And in fact, they just put out their guidelines, and one of our participants read from those guidelines. And the advice was really, if you're going to look at a construct at a domain, do it within a disorder and not across disorders, because if you go across disorders, you're going to have to validate whatever scales you're using in each population separately, and then link those scale scores to something that's meaningful for the patient in their lives and has impact. So that's an undertaking that no one is going to, no pharma company is going to touch that. I mean, that's just too much work.
Yeah.
So
that
No.
that was the how can I do that?
Here, yeah.
Yeah, you want to comment on that, or you want to have my
Yeah.
next slide on actions? Yeah, Nathan wants to.
I was just going to take a minute to introduce ourselves, if that's okay, and
Sure.
just
Sorry.
just give you a context and background in terms of where we are when it pertains to DSM, if that's okay, so that you'll have a context to the conversation going forward. So for those who do not, thank you, Marian, again for inviting us to this conversation and this meeting. This is incredibly important, and unfortunately we could not be there in person, but I promise going forward for all the meetings, we'll prioritize that, just like we did in Nice. So thank you. I would really appreciate that. I was also glad that the leadership of the future DSM Strategic Committee was able to join at a short notice. Dr. Maria Okendo, who is, unfortunately, she is traveling, but she is joined on the phone, so she is listening.
I'm here, thank you.
Thanks, Maria, again for making the effort. And so she is going to chair the committee, and myself, along with Dr. Jonathan Alpert, who's chair at Montefiore in New York. He is also agreed to join. Thank you, Jonathan, for joining. And then we also have Diana Clark, who was there in Nice, and she is the senior advisor to the future DSM, and she was there through DSM-5. So she has encyclopedic knowledge of all things DSM. And so just to give you a little bit of background, so I actually, Marian, I just sent a couple of slides, if that helps. So it can put things into context and see that way you can get an idea. I can also try and share those. I'm not very good at that, but otherwise I'll just talk through those. Those are only, let me see if I can quickly share.
Yeah, please, I think that's easy.
I sent, they should be in your inbox. If it's easier for you to share, Federico.
Was that sorry?
You sent
you sent it to me? Okay.
I sent it to you just a couple of minutes ago. So it might be that way. It might be easier to share it from your end. So in the meantime, I can keep talking, right? So
I was saying, Nitin, if not, Lamia can just share her screen because she has them, right?
yeah, whatever is easier. I thought it would be easier to share on their end. So it's only 3 or 4 slides, but I think it would provide a good context. But in the meantime, we are not at the, just to give you a background, the APA Board of Trustees approved the formation of a committee and starting the work on the next iteration of the DSM. So we began that work. This was approval we got in January. I think I mentioned it in the Nice meeting. And so we have had, we have formed the committee, and we met for the first time last week, actually, in person in New York. And Bruce is one of the senior members of the committee. And so thank you, Bruce, again for joining. So we need to make sure that everybody is part of the conversation. Would it be easier to just try? let me see if I can share it on my end.
We're sharing on our end.
Oh, you are? Okay, perfect. Yeah, so just to give you a very broad 60,000-foot view, so the goals of the future DSM Strategic Committee are to decide the overall strategic direction of the next DSM, where does the DSM need to go. And this needs to be based and influenced by scientific developments in the field that can impact the structure, the definition, criteria of the disorders that are currently used in the DSM. We also want to make an effort to harmonize the DSM with ICD-11, RDoC, HITOP, and any other important developments that are happening in the field. That is what you guys have been talking about for the last 2 or 3 days. In addition to that, we also want to make sure we incorporate other important aspects that are relevant to patient, clinicians, and everybody, such as social determinants of mental health, race and ethnicity, suicide risk assessment in the DSM, amongst other issues. There are a whole host of such issues. Then make the DSM up to date with current issues, including things like climate change and mental health. Harmonize the DSM with measurement-based care, which is a very sort of not mature field in the area of psychiatry, but it's instrumental in improving the quality of care and learning healthcare systems. And while this is going on, while we decide the strategic direction for the DSM, we want to continue with the ongoing DSM-5 TR work with new proposals and continue to evaluate those in a data-driven way. So if I could have the next slide. So we sketched out a very rough roadmap with the plans, with goals and matrices, and to decide, and this will be, of course, fine-tune work groups and create subcommittees depending on expertise and areas of need and what are the responsibilities. But the most important part I want to highlight is right from the get-go, we want to focus on collaborating with national, international organizations, agencies, including federal agencies, and most important, the research community, because the DSM needs to be always data-driven and research-driven. And then the implementation stage, and finally monitor and continue to maintain. And how can we make the DSM so that it actually continues to evolve in real time and that stays in tune with the developments in the research and academia, as well as other developments in the field. And if I could go to the next slide. And as a first step as a meeting, what we also did was we did a SWOT analysis for the DSM. And it's important to recognize what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses, and what it leads to is the opportunities. And the strengths are clinical utility for the patients. Patients still use DSM, clinicians use DSM, insurance companies and administrators. It still provides a critical value to all these roles, and it still needs to continue to do that, especially in the US. I know it's probably Europe and other systems are not as dependent on the DSM for these reasons, but in the US, it still forms the mainstay. It does provide the consistent language, although as the research develops, we need to continue to evolve that language. But for now, it has provided the structure for clinicians as well as researchers. And DSM-5, as I mentioned in the last meeting, did make an effort to introduce dimensional concepts and acknowledge the impact of culture, sex, gender, ethno-racial identity on disorders and suicide considerations. But they were still in the early stages. As you mentioned, Marion, earlier, biomarkers are still not ready for prime time, but we need to work together to figure out ways to incorporate and be creative about how we can all sort of join hands to strengthen rather than develop in silos. The weaknesses, we made a strong effort to understand the weaknesses, which is, again, it's very familiar to this committee, is categorical design. There is a feeling that it stifles the dimensional research. Biomarkers are difficult to fit into categories. It does not yet align with RDoC framework. It's not sensitive to social determinants of mental health and other cultural, ethno-racial, and gender and geographic diversity. Assessment of functioning is not the main part of the DSM. It still stays in the appendix, and when the DSM removed the GAF scores, there is a feeling in the field that something vital was lost. So how do we bring that back in? It does not incorporate current issues in mental health, but such as climate impact on mental health. And how does that lead to opportunities? We can use this as an opportunity by working together to create a framework that will then integrate the categorical framework that is valuable to the clinicians and other stakeholders, but at the same time make sure that the DSM incorporates dimensions and biomarkers. And we need to come together to figure out ways to do that. How can it provide framework to stimulate and encourage research by incorporating scientific constructs into formulations? Because then it can organically enhance the science, whether it's somebody writing for grants or getting funding and so on. And making it truly global by bringing in diversity and aligning with global issues. We need to figure out how to bring back functioning, and also, as you touched upon, Marion, how to bring in digital health integration or other things such as AI and machine learning and so on. I don't need to go into the threats of the DSM in detail, but they are essentially what I mentioned earlier. ICD-11 also has the diagnostic criteria, which was some sort of a combination between DSM and ICD-11, but then they are starting to develop in silos. So how we can bring everybody together for a conversation. And we want to make sure that scientific advances, which tend to diverge from the DSM and they're not aligned, but how do we bring them back together into the fold so that they can help each other? And we don't want to unnecessarily foster the silos because then overall it works to the detriment of the field. So I just wanted to give this background. So one of the things that we are doing, and again, thanks for the invitation for the last meeting and this meeting. In response to that, we requested Martien to represent ECNP, and he has kindly agreed to be on the DSM, the future DSM committee. So in addition to that, we also want to bring in all the organizations that are active, such as ECNP, Biological Psychiatry, ECNP, World Psychiatric Association, and all the organizations that are important, relevant, and how do we keep them in the loop? How do we bring them in the conversation? So we want to make a very active effort to bring everybody in the conversation going forward, right from the get-go in this process. So once again, this brings me back full circle to say again, thank you so much for inviting us to participate, because this is exactly what we want to do. Jonathan or Maria, if you want to say a word or two, that would be great. I don't know if Maria can, given that she's on the call, but Jonathan?
I just wanted to, I wanted to echo Nitin's comments about our deep interest in collaborating with the different scientific organizations, psychiatry and neuroscience, so that we have a really strong opportunity to move forward and to, in particular, move our diagnostics forward.
Thank you, Maria.
I also would echo what Nitin and Maria said, and we're very grateful to be included in this, and really interested in the good news and the but slide that you had, because I feel like we're all in this together and trying to put more on the good news ledger, and as we move together as a field, and less on the but side, and trying to the extent possible incorporating the good news part into the future DSM.
One thing that if I can ask a question, have you all looked at including regulatory, the FDA and EMA in this framework that y'all are developing? Obviously, the drug development is going to be driven in large part with what regulatory approves or doesn't approve, and our meeting, we were kind of all, it was a sober moment listening to the regulatory agencies and how they look at psychiatric disease and what they allow and don't allow, and as far as outcome measures and constructs and this and the like.
Yes, so there's you're right. I think you put your finger on it earlier also, that it's important to get them in the conversation sooner than later, because then it works to the benefit of the whole field. Geographically, fortunately, we are at an advantage to at least work with the FDA and the other regulatory agencies. We also are making sure that not just the regulatory agencies, but NIH, in an unofficial manner, because there are some government regulations and restrictions that prevent them from actively participating. But we are trying to figure out other ways to bring them into conversation, at least the major NIH institutes that deal with neuroscience, such as NIDA and NIMH and so on and so forth. So that's absolutely the plan.
Maybe I can add, hi Nitin, this is Martin, I'm here in Brussels as well. Good to see you.
Yeah. Oh, great.
I was here to meet as well. Just to say that following the Nice meeting the ECNP organized on this, we were actually with the steering committee forming this roadmap initiative paper we're currently writing, and both representatives from EMA and FDA are involved also in providing input for that paper. So we are discussing this with the regulators. So just as an addition to the discussion.
Yeah.
And maybe another question is there also involvement of patient organizations in this discussion and process?
I am so glad you asked this question, because we do want to have a somebody with lived experience on the strategic committee. Absolutely. We haven't yet identified that person, but we are in active conversations because it's critical and vitally important. We think that somebody with lived experience has to be in the part of the conversation and at the table. You're absolutely right. I forgot to mention that.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there's a move toward including some information about the comorbidities in these patient groups. There's, all of the diagnoses cannot be explained by another medical comorbidity, but at the same time, we know that there's a tremendous comorbidity with both autoimmunity and diabetes and cardiovascular diseases, and more data suggests that this is not different disorders, it's two sides of the same coin. And so perhaps including that dimension, I think, would be very helpful, because right now we're contributing to this duality of psychiatry or somatic, and that's not true. And we know that. So I think the DSM in a new version could really make a huge difference to the advancement of the field by acknowledging this comorbidity and the significance of this.
I agree. I think you raise an important point there as well. The DSM, up to DSM-4, there was, of course, Axis 4 there, which at least was it Axis, and maybe Axis 3, which documented the comorbidities, and there was a organic way of documenting comorbidities. So there is a feeling in the field that got lost with DSM-5 when the Axis system was taken away. So I want to stress that we have only had one meeting of the strategic committee. But we are taking exactly a lot of feedback like this, and we plan to continue similar dialogues at every forum and conference so that we get more such feedback, and then the committee can decide how to bring back these kinds of important issues back into the fold of the DSM.
Sure. So thank you for these points, Anneli here from Olink. To expand a bit on Brenda's comment, does the plan include any kind of use case? I'm thinking from almost a product perspective on this. I mean, to ensure that there's satisfaction with the new DSM version, will the process involve sort of profiles? I mean, we're talking about insurance companies, we're talking about patients, clinicians. They all have different demands as they go ahead and use the new version. And typically when we develop a product within our company, we always start with the customer in mind, so to speak. And does this process involve a similar analysis at the get-go to ensure that we're meeting? I mean, it's almost a mirroring of what we see with the patient perspective in the actual precision medicine space, right? It's just an open question if that's included.
Yeah, I think it should be, and how we will, I'm almost certain we will have these conversations, how to actually concretize that plan and all. The committee will need to come up with creative ways of incorporating that. But I think these are all really important questions, and they should be taken into account, absolutely. Which is why the value of conversations like this, right? Because unless we hear these kinds of dialogues and conversations, we are not going to be able to make the process rich and well-rounded.
If I may to just continue on your on the image metaphor that you used, maybe the product here is for not the patient but for the doctor. Am I right with the DSM? And coming back on what we said about all the data, etc., is the DSM also thought about kind of minimum data sets kind of collection, because we have a uniformization of methodology when we do a diagnosis?
So if I understand the question correctly, I think DSM as it is now, at least in the US, patients also use quite a bit. They use it for understanding and formulation of their own understanding of what their suffering is. So the patients do provide an important stakeholder group for the DSM as it stands now, which is another reason to include the lived experience person in going forward with the DSM. In regards to the data question, the DSM itself does not have, well, we haven't sort of formulated this yet, but we don't maintain a data set. People, when they are submitting proposals for changes or new disorders in the DSM, they're required to present a lot of data and scientific evidence, and then the committee evaluates those things. One thought that we have at the APA, one of the things that we are also doing is that we are creating a clinical data registry with the goal similar to have a large data set available if we have to field test something, if we have to do test something in clinicians or patient populations and so on. So we are actively involved in building a patient data registry at the APA. We haven't figured out a way to link those, but I'm sure that's one of our goals. I don't know if it completely answers your question, but these are sort of ideas that are formulating, and we want to just keep on maturing them as we go along and these conversations expand.
I have a question on methods. We have a difficult discussion here and everywhere. I think we have categorical disorders which have been described with good inter-rater reliability by DSM, at least DSM-5. We are discovering subgroups with homogeneous entities with biomarkers and mechanisms, for example, autoimmune psychosis. And we have lots of other examples coming from the field of immunology in particular, and probably other groups. And we also have dimensions, at least we're searching for dimensions that cut across disorders. And I think they don't, all these entities have not the same use, if I may say. So the disorders are needed for patients, insurance, doctors to discuss between them, exactly with the parallel with cancer. We still use lung cancer. Yeah. Even if for treatment, they seem to be using biomarkers. So biomarkers that target mechanism and leads to mechanism-based treatment. And they also have subgroups. So what is your vision of how to work on these different steps? Categorical disorders, subgroups, and dimensions.
I'm smiling because Bruce Cuthbert is going to tell us a creative solution to do that, right, Bruce? So I think I don't think any one of us have a clear answer, but this is exactly why we need to come up with some way of incorporating exactly what you just articulated so well, Marianne, that how do we bring these two things together, which are necessary and vital for development of the field, but right now are developing in silos. And we have to figure that out. And that's going to be one challenge that we're going to have to tackle pretty soon.
But also the overlap between the diagnoses.
Right.
Patients have 5 or 6.
Yeah.
Because dimensions are probably going to cut across disorders. This is what we're looking for.
Yeah.
So it's going to be difficult to include in a categorical vision.
But if there are any ideas, please send them. Keep sending them our way. We would love to get more feedback and more input.
But if you go back to the cancer example, they have lung cancer and breast cancer, but they also have metastasized cancer. And I think actually we have patients that, I have patients that have all the diagnoses because nobody knows what it is and they've tried everything. And they're their sickest patients. They're the ones that are, consuming in tremendous amounts. And so even a category for those which are uncategorized, that don't fit in the categories would be helpful, because right now we're shoving them into different categories and they're being because I do have a group that they have everything.
Time perspective, because maybe with the time they sort of add on comorbidities, either psychiatric and or somatic comorbidities, and at the end we don't have a clear vision of anything.
That's right.
Very sick is the diagnosis. Right.
Yeah. And you're right. I mean, we are talking about silos within the field of mental health or psychiatry, silos between biomarkers and dimensions and categorical diagnosis. But then there's silos between different aspects of medicine. And we often lose the vision that at the center, there is still one patient who's suffering from multiple things, whether it's cancer and depression or Parkinson's and depression and so on. And how do we comprehensively look at it as one entity rather than compartmentalizing it, because then it doesn't benefit the patient. Unfortunately, I have to jump away for another call. I don't know if it will take more than 15 minutes, but thank you again. I'll join back as soon as I'm done with the other call. But Jonathan, Maria, and Diana, I hope you are able to stay on a little bit longer, and Bruce is here as well.
Thank you very much for your time and for sharing all this information with us. It was great.
Thank you.
So how do you want to pursue this discussion? Because we had planned to have a discussion on the next steps and how we can move the field forward regarding precision psychiatry. Do we want to continue discussing this, or would you like to have a discussion on, I don't know, how do we want to do that? How long do you have? Like maybe a question of time as well.
Yeah.
Or do we want to interact on DSM questions on DSM?
Yeah,
method?
I would be intrigued to hear what Bruce, I mean, I know Bruce, you're part of this this effort with the DSM. I mean, how are you all looking at integrating the RDoC concepts into DSM? Is there kind of like obviously this is something that's going to have to occur maybe in stages, and it would be great if DSM-6 could be the jumping off point for really doing something completely different. I don't know what y'all's vision or what you're planning, what you're thinking at this point.
Since you asked me, I'll go first, but turn it over to John and Diana as well. I think you've heard a lot about what we are thinking about. First, as Nitin said, we've only had one introductory meeting just to get started with this committee. So we are in nowhere even on the road. We're just getting the cars warmed up. Second, it's like the oncology metaphor that Mario mentioned. That's probably the common metaphor we've all been talking about, the idea of maybe we can say, well, if you remember the BSNP trial that I showed, that you can take patients with schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, and psychotic bipolar disorder, but if you put them into one big lump and look at biomarkers and clusters, they fall out a different way, but that doesn't mean you necessarily have to come up with a new diagnostic category. You can say, okay, well, any of these people with this particular problem of any of these things has the specific, say, the blunted EEG activity. And so, that would be something. So that would be a way to go at it. Yeah, it's also true, as you mentioned, that this will certainly require lots of stages or gradual steps along the way to be determined. But on the other hand, as Nitin said, he's already thinking about a DSM that changes continuously the way other areas of medicine change. As soon as they get a really convincing couple of phase 3 trials, bang, that's in there. It's not like, well, is it this thing or that thing that they go. So those are initial thoughts, but we're right, again, just at the start. So Jonathan, Diana, any other comments?
I think that was really well expressed, Bruce, that we are just at the early stages, but I think the hope is, as Marianne was saying, that there are different uses in a way for different components of DSM. And the, for example, if we think about something like anhedonia or, some other dimension, that helps us a lot in terms of thinking about mechanisms and new treatment development. On the other hand, currently, we would treat somebody with anhedonia who has a bipolar mood disorder differently from the way we would treat somebody with unipolar depression based on our current medications and the risks and effectiveness of different treatments for bipolar disorder rather than compared with unipolar depression. But it's not irrelevant that there are dimensions that phenomenologically there's a significant overlap, and certainly the significant overlap between bipolar disorder and schizophrenia is something that we're very much aware of. So being able to preserve the uses of DSM in terms of some of the current categories, but Andrew, as you were saying, trying to make DSM-6 a bridge into the future where at least there's an acknowledgement of biomarkers and an acknowledgement of dimensions that suggest cross-cutting mechanisms. So that's certainly our hope. I mean, we're obviously, as you could see, we're at the very early stages, but that's so much the hope of what we're doing right now.
So hi, good morning. I'll jump in and add that, DSM-5, going from DSM-4 to DSM-5, the task force did attempt to do some of this. And so part of what they did to address the overlap in symptoms, or at least I should say cross-cutting symptoms, was to create that DSM cross-cutting measure, which was supposed to be a review of mental systems that was supposed to be used with patients at every visit. And within that cross-cutting measure, it captured 13 different domains of symptoms. For example, the depression, anxiety, anhedonia, we had substance use, somatic symptoms. It had 13 different domains. And the idea was that all of these symptoms, and we understood that we needed to expand that cross-cutting measure over time, but all of these domains could cut across diagnostic different disorders and actually impact on treatment. And so part of what we're thinking about is how do we continue to expand that as we go forward and further develop the DSM.
That's a great idea. That was a great idea. Could you put them in as qualifiers? Because it would seem to me that if you had a depression with some qualifier, that might appeal more to a regulatory agency as a thing, as opposed to something separate that is a series of dimensions that sit apart from the diagnoses themselves. Because the regulatory agencies are looking at diagnoses, and if you had a diagnosis with a qualifier that included those dimensions that you just mentioned, it might be an interesting thing. I remember somebody, I think it was Annie Crystal, was telling me about hypersomnia. Was it a hypersomnia that he was talking about? A depression with hypersomnia. And they were trying to somehow work it all out, but there wasn't such an animal that the FDA recognized, and they had to twist themselves into a pretzel to create this thing because they had to hit both depression and they had to hit the insomnia. Or I think it wasn't hypersomnia. I think it was insomnia, and that's what they were trying to do. But if he had had a qualifier there of some sort, then he might be able to, it might be built into the system as a qualifier in depression. Or whatever.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And it's something that we just need to kind of refine more as we go forward. I think DSM, the task force for DSM-5 started out thinking about it, but then how did they incorporate it in the book? And it became a separate section, which created a little bit of a problem. It's similar to when I heard the question around looking at somatic symptoms or somatic disorders and realizing that the comorbidity between them. And when DSM-5, when they got rid of the multi-axial system, the idea was that whether a person had major depression, they had cardiovascular disease, all of those would all make it on as, you know, would be listed as the combination of a patient disorder, and they're all equally important. And so that's part of the reason why they did that, saying that if you put them on different axes, you're saying that they have different levels of importance, right? Different hierarchy. And so they took that away. So we have to kind of, as we're moving forward, think through how do we fix that? So yeah, just wanted to throw that in there as well. But yeah, we need to figure out how do we, and you know, part of the interesting thing is we do try to add, and I know you say qualifiers, and I see DSM tried to add a number of things and they call them specifiers. But then we're finding that clinicians sometimes don't necessarily use those specifiers as we look through the DSM and look through data, any kind of claims data, where you notice that clinicians tend to use the big diagnostic categories and don't necessarily use the specifiers. So I'm just a little bit concerned that if we add the qualifiers, our clinicians are going to equally not use them, but it's something for us to think about as we're moving forward.
There may be a research, more for the research side of things, or for regulatory purposes.
Okay, makes sense.
Because the reason I'm asking the question is I've been working in multidisciplinary settings, and a couple insights have hit me in the last year. I'm working with they have this big database over autoinflammatory conditions and all the symptoms and associated to the different genes. And I've met a few of these patients, and I know they have huge psychiatric comorbidities. And I was like really excited. There's no psychiatric comorbidities described at all in the database, at all. None, not one. And that's because the psychiatrists haven't been sitting at the table when they've categorized these patients, right? It's all done by the clinical geneticists. And once they've got a diagnosis, then psychiatry leaves the table because it's not psychiatry anymore. Yeah. And so it's there like subtly, like as aggression or maybe cognitive symptoms, but it's like the actual psychiatric phenotypes are not well described because we're not there. And we're not there because we've written them out of our system. We've decided that that's not psychiatry anymore just because they have another medical diagnosis. And it's the same story for all of the autoimmune disorders. The psychiatric symptoms are not well described, they're not recognized, and they're not acknowledged. And that's a false bias because we've left the table. And I don't know how to get us back at the table, because if we're not there, these descriptions will not be included.
Yeah, and you know, interestingly, when we were doing DSM-5, we did include primary care at the table, and which is part of the reason why we went with that whole idea of removing the multi-axial system and putting everything on one axis, just using one axis. So yeah, Nitin talked about it. I mean, just getting rid of the silo and us all working together, and that's going to be important for us to do as we improve and work forward with the DSM.
Maybe just to reinforce this point, it's really important because, well, we all know that it's the first cause of death of our patients, somatic comorbidity. Not really well not treated and not considered by GP or any medical specialties that just don't take it into account. And neither do the psychiatrists. So there really is a problem with this silo functioning.
Yeah. Yeah, and the DSM with their exclusion criteria, this cannot be explained by another medical condition, is reinforcing this very false idea that they have nothing to do with each other. It's not true. So I think if we really want to make a difference for the field, that is the most important thing we can do.
Well, it's important both for health, for care,
yeah,
but also for research, because it's a way to discover new biomarkers, new maybe repositioning for drugs that might be worse, and it's really important.
Dr. Clark, you brought up the questions around clinicians not using the specifiers well. So I think part of it, at least as a practicing clinicians, when the DSM-5 introduced the mixed features for MDD, like a decade later, I still don't see it ever being used or conceptualized being used properly. So I think where is the focus on engaging clinicians? I mean, I think there is the assumption that it's coming from ABA, so it's representing the clinicians, but there is still a pretty big gap into when the DSM-5 or 5DR comes out and what the clinicians are perceiving about it. It's still that top down, right? Like, so that was like the disease model top down versus something that's more organic and that requires longer term investment, engaging with clinicians, engaging with like residents. What are the trainees getting at, right? Like, because all they see are maybe during the training residency programs may not be building this part as part of their and then whatever we learn in residency is what we carry for the rest of our lives mostly. So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's also just important, and it's something we're trying to make sure we do better. It's just, as we're informing the field, as we're making changes and having discussion, we certainly bring in the clinician's voice. We did that when we were doing DSM-5. We had open public comment. We got feedback from the field. We modified things accordingly. And so right now we're making sure that we have more clinicians sitting at the table during this planning for the future DSM. But then we also need to take that additional step that once things are updated, we spend more time educating the field. And I think that's where I think there's also that gap.
Would it make sense to go also from sitting at the table to actual kind of field-based data collection on how things are being used? I mean, maybe that's already included, but.
Yeah, we did that for DSM. I mean, I was talking to one of my mentees and she actually said, how come nobody ever used that large database that you have with all the DSM field trial, with all the diagnostic criteria? We have about over 3,000 patients, different clinicians using the diagnostic criteria, giving us feedback on how the criteria worked. And so we have that database and it's sitting there at the APA across multiple sites in the US. But we took into consideration clinicians' voice. We went to the field, we pilot tested the criteria, we took their feedback, we modified things, and then we actually had their feedback again when we did the field trial. So we did do field testing, and we always do, and we always want to hear what the clinicians think. Is it easy to use? And that ties into even our work on the personality disorder, the new model of personality disorder. And part of the feedback we got from the field was, even though they do understood that this is how personality disorder might present, it was very challenging for them to operationalize. And so, especially in a busy clinic. So we have to take those things into consideration, because if clinicians don't know how to use it, then it's not going to be effective. So it's the balance between the two, right? But yeah, we do field testing.
Yeah, so maybe one aspect of this could be the timing of it. So to get that discussion going, even in the design phase, rather than having a draft that's then evaluated. So maybe that opens up more doors on how to.
Okay. Yeah.
It's just a thought. Maybe it's irrelevant to this discussion, but that's how I would think about it from a product perspective.
As a two-tiered system would be interesting, because a lot of what we're doing works in a population, but then we have the population where nothing we're doing is working. So maybe some kind of complex psychiatry section for the cases that
How would you define that?
Maybe where standard treatments have been gone through and not responding, where patients have a typical features, a typical trajectories, like sudden debut of OCD when they've never had anxiety before, sudden debut of psychosis out of the blue without a prodromal period, like that type of trajectory. Use the autoimmune psychosis red flags and expand them so that you also capture late onset metabolic disorders and immunodeficiencies and all these other things that are lurking in our patient groups and not responding to our regular treatments because they're different animals.
But if I may, there is also the problem of time. It's not the same when the disorder starts and when you have 50 years of evolution of a disorder, and this is difficult to capture in a DSM style system. Disorder change. It's like, again, following the metaphor of cancer. It's exactly as if it was the same for the beginning of a tumor, and when the tumor has it several organs plus all sorts of other comorbid disorders. The cancer people, they don't work like that. They really have a sort of trajectory for patients, and they describe, and I don't know how to do that, but it's just
staging, such like that.
Yeah, well, stage didn't work very well. So maybe we need something else.
Brain biopsies.
And
sure.
I don't know why I'm saying this, but I remember the old days, they had research diagnostic criteria that we used to use that was separate for research, and then there was the clinical diagnoses that. Does anybody remember those days, or am I just making those days up? Is that some fantasy of my memory? Didn't we used to have that at one point?
That is correct. And in fact, the basis for earlier editions of the DSM was rooted in the research diagnostic criteria. So you're absolutely right.
But I guess nobody wants to go back there and somehow appeal to the regulatory agencies around a separate, more research, derived or informed diagnostic framework that's used for regulatory purposes. I guess if that would be just psychotic and nobody would know what was going, but we're just as we move towards precision psychiatry, we're running into significant problems with the regulatory agencies who are stuck on these Hamilton depression scales and Montgomery-Åsberg depression scales as outcome variables, and they really don't capture at all anything that is precise in terms of mechanistic processes that affect the specific neurotransmitter systems or neurocircuits in the brain that bespeak relatively specific behavioral outcomes. Which
one suggestion in that aspect, I wonder if this group might try to get a hold of Steve Hyman. He's one of the most reputable scientists and psychiatrists in the world, really, and he has a very open conversation with our head of the FDA. I chatted with him now and then the last few years. I think if he were able to, and I have the sense that the FDA is aware of these problems, but they haven't really doubled down on what they could do or really jumped in. I know there's someone, a relatively new person there that's talking to Rob Califf and talking about, what could we do, and they're thinking about it. But it is a big change when you think of how long they've been doing that and how that whole system is pretty well set in stone now, and they really have to do some talking. But that's what would be important. And as you could see from that one quote that I made at the end of the talk about, mental disorders are heterogeneous deviations from health. He has that kind of viewpoint. And I think if he could throw his heft into the problem, we might, maybe not, make some progress in this area.
That's a great idea, Bruce. And actually, he's written quite a bit about this issue and the failures in terms of trying to develop novel therapeutics around some of these issues. And is there, speaking of him and others, you said that we could give feedback to the committee about ideas that we might have. What do you think is the most effective mechanism to communicate with a committee in terms of ideas that we might have? I mean, one of the things we're looking at is our next steps, and that might be incorporated in the next steps, is to somehow communicate something clear to the committee around what we're thinking.
Thank you for
promote.
Thank you for bringing that up. Just yesterday we met and we're talking about the need to develop a very specific process for making sure that we receive input from key organizations such as ECNP as we're moving the process along. And so we will be defining that, but I would also argue that, especially with a group like ECNP, I don't want to speak for Jonathan and Nitin, but certainly my email address is publicly available, and I am very interested in talking with people about ideas and suggestions, because we need, really, it needs to be, we need to take this opportunity to evaluate and accept as much input as possible so we can make the best possible decisions going forward.
Thank you, Maria. That's very kind. And is there, how long is the process going to take? Is there any sort of sense of the timelines here?
I would say that Nitin or Diana would have to speak to that. It's clearly not a one-year process. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, Diana's laughing, so I'm sure we're talking about a long.
I know. Well, you know,
before I retire, maybe.
If you think about it, well, we want to first kind of develop this roadmap, and I'm anticipating that even just to work together as a group, pull in information from other groups, and to then create that roadmap, I thought it probably will take us maybe the good part of a year to do that, and then we can start thinking thereafter. But right now, I'm trying to take it one step at a time. So that's where my head is. Let's develop that roadmap, and then after we have that roadmap, then we can think we have a better idea of what the timeline would look like. But also, one of the things that I just do want you to know, we do have a DSM mailbox. And Lamia Yusuf, Dr. Yusuf, who's on the phone, she's on the call as well. She's a DSM operations person, so she takes care of all things DSM, and she monitors that mailbox religiously. And so, you know, Lamia can give the information for that mailbox. We monitor it, and we go through all the comments that comes in through that mailbox, and then, you know, sit down, whether it's a DSM-5, for the comments that have come in over the last few years have really been on we go to the DSM steering committee with these questions and comments. So you can actually use the DSM mailbox for now, so that it comes to a centralized place, and we can coordinate how the information gets to the different working groups. And another thing that I was thinking that we can probably do, Maria, and we can talk about it after, is actually create a portal similar to how we have the portal for submission for new proposal or any kind of changes to the DSM. We can do the same thing for the future DSM. Just create a portal so information can get submitted that way as well.
That would be great. That would be excellent.
Okay, excellent. So maybe we could all work on that and make suggestion to Martin, if he's the representative of ECNP in the DSM, so that you don't receive hundreds of things all over the place. If that works with you.
Yes, that would be excellent. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Things, comments, thoughts. Thank you so much. You guys are great. I mean, it's so it's great to have this as part of our meeting here, and we really appreciate your time, and we know you're all busy people, and we're very appreciative of your spending time with us.
Historical moment for us. So thank you very, very much.
Yeah, thanks for including us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, there's still people, are there people participating still?
There's about 20 people in the meeting.
Are they?
Do you want some questions?
We don't know.
They're asking questions.
Yeah,
that was before.
One question for
Bruce.
Is DSM used in insurance purpose?
And there is one.
Yes. Yes, it is.
Oh, okay.
But they're all hooked to ICD codes. So Bruce, we're counting on you to get your RDoC constructs into DSM. One way to save the field, because I think I think, you know, what you're saying, it was very odd, your presentation, because it came after the person from the EMA who was you heard her.
Yes, right. Yeah.
And you heard Martine's reading from the guidelines.
No, that was,
He had the receipts. So.
Yeah, no, I don't know if you recorded that. I'd like to hear that discussion again. I was like, oh boy, that's really, it was a very polite discussion, but very much at loggerheads. So
yeah, she just poked her head in and then ran away.
She had a difficult lunch, I can tell you.
Did she?
Yes.
Uh-oh.
Well, nice discussion, but, you know, polite still.
I got you.
Yeah, no, I think that many of you know that Nitin was at NIMH before he went to APA. And he was actually in charge of the whole clinical trials overseeing of all the things that we funded in that area. So, and he's very much invested in RDoC as well. So, you know, that's a good thing. He recruited me to become one of the members of that committee, as he said. So I do hope that there is, you know, some strength there to say, you know, this is a way that we need to go. I wouldn't be surprised if we do wind up with something like some of the things that the group has mentioned, like maybe a two-tier system, or, you know, the kind of the clinical DSM and the research DSM sorts of things. I'm not sure, and that may be a little while until we can sort out how we could make faster changes to the DSM and how we go. It's going to be very complex, but I think we need to get something with the DSM started in the right direction. And, you know, even at the start meeting, we kind of had a sidebar that saying maybe the DSM-6 will be the one just to get it going and kind of get organized, and then hope that the DSM-7 would be kind of the right way to get it so that we can change all the time. So, but maybe, as Nitin said, he wants to change the DSM constantly. So I think all of us, you know, even if I can just close that point, even for all of us researchers, we have to be mindful of the continuous change we have to do with our research. For instance, with anhedonia, that's a very popular, if you will, topic now, rightfully so. At the same time, we're seeing a lot of data about needing to change how we think about reward prediction errors, dopamine, and all that sort of thing with respect to appetitive stuff. Like there's just a well-known animal paper, again, using computational models to look at things in Aaron Calipari's lab, saying this in summary, this group examines dopaminergic information encoding in the nucleus accumbens. This work revises the long-held theory of dopamine as a reward prediction molecule and provides a novel framework for dopamine as a perceived saliency signal, whether appetitive or aversive situations. These results unite multiple theories of dopamine signaling and have broad implications for psychopathologies. So that could make a big difference, but that's, you know, there's a lot of discussion going on about that whole thing right now, but there's that suggestion that maybe instead of saying anhedonia, it's about if people aren't happy or motivated, it's for both things. Maybe it's an issue of activation or something like that, whether it's good or bad. So that, and I'm not saying it's one or the other. It could be one in some situations and others in a different one, and we're going to have to tease all that out.
And Bruce, are those captured in the positive valence systems construct? Aren't both of those concepts captured there, or are they split out of that?
Not really, because this stuff is pretty new. When we first started RDoc back in 2009, 2010, just putting it together, I thought about, there was enough data back then that I thought maybe we should combine this and talk about motivation, because we know of all the overlaps. But we thought the field is not ready for that. If we said that, they said, "Are you guys nuts? Come on." And we're a little ahead of the field then. But now would be a time to say, how do we do that? At the least, we need to start indicating that. Just so you guys know, also in terms of RDoc, we've been working, as you could see, even though my talk was very short, in terms of RDoc, we've tried to say we at NIMH are not taking responsibility for all the changes that happen. There are like 4 people in our whole RDoc unit. It's not all we can do to just kind of keep the door open and we don't have the resources to really have more workshops to say, here's a new way of the framework, here are new constructs, new domains, and so forth. Rather, we're saying these are examples. Here's how we would like to see people go. The example I just read was a perfect example of new approaches with constructs. But we've talked about a group maybe like all of the ACNPs and ECNPs of the world to be the group to say, to vet a lot of these new things, to say, this makes sense, let's go with it. Because we can't do that, but we want to go fast. So that's how fast everything is going now.
That's a very interesting idea, because adding, just as DSM evolves, the RDoc could evolve as well and incorporate some of these constructs, but having those kind of things lumped under things like positive valence. I think there was even a paper in Neuropsychopharmacology where they were saying they were proposing a negative valence disorder. I can't remember who wrote that paper.
I remember that. Yeah.
I think it was what's his name? On his name, Bill Potter. Was he maybe?
Perhaps, yeah.
I think he was an author on that one. But I think those are kind of capture these large constructs that there are a lot of things that are interesting within them that are worth.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Anyway, maybe that's another step. Sure. That's another action item that we can add to our list.
We can make a list now.
Yeah.
You want to take the online question?
Oh, is there online questions? We can't.
From Christopher.
I agree with the movement.
Oh, that's another one. So from Christopher, it was, does the group think that we should be moving away from diagnosis such as MDRS or MD and towards transdiagnostic tests such as SHAPS for anhedonia?
That's for Andy.
Well, Bruce, did you hear that question?
Yeah, could you say it again? I didn't quite catch everything. So,
Christopher, maybe you want to talk?
No, they don't have, you can't.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I haven't been very active in. I've been listening to everything, but because I haven't really. I wasn't there at the last meeting, but I've really enjoyed all the talks and a lot of the subject matter really reflects how I've approached treatment of patients and also when I was doing research as well. But I do feel that we should be looking more at treating individual symptoms rather than like saying something is a whole condition and trying to squeeze people into these pigeonholes, so to speak. We should be looking at, for example, like focusing on treating anhedonia and what the biological basis of that is. And so, but my question is does the group agree with approaching treating individual symptoms, such as using the SHAP scale rather than the Montgomery or the Hamilton scales. That's what I mean, because also it feeds into the discussions about where we're going with DSM-6 as well. Sorry, am I clear in what I'm asking?
Yes, thank you. That
Thank
was
you.
clear. All of us could contribute. My own 2 cents would be yes, that's the direction in which we are headed, broadly speaking.
And I think we would agree here as well that obviously the MADRS and the HAM-D is the darling of the regulatory agencies, and so we're sort of forced as we confront the regulatory agencies, we're sort of forced into that framework for the moment. But I think the hope is the field is evolving to the point where we're thinking more specific around circuits and pathways that then lead to specific changes in specific symptom dimensions or development of specific symptom dimensions that are much more delimited than that sort of broad a series of symptoms that are captured in these other scales. And it's important to remember what's the backstory. And the backstory is all of the drugs that were developed initially are very broad spectrum in their activity. So the SSRIs and certainly imipramine and thorazine and all of the antipsychotics, they treat everything. And so you can use a scale like that and you can hit the target. And as Bruce pointed out, with a fast fail with the kappa opioid, it doesn't hit the HAM-D and the MADRS, but it hits the SHAPs. Because it's specific, it's hitting a specific circuit that Wayne Drevitz talked a little bit about yesterday. We've had the same thing within inflammation, where you give a levodopa and you hit a circuit. It's a reward motivation circuit in the accumbens, and you see improvement in anhedonia. We did hit the Hamilton, but I think if you wait long enough, sometimes the effects kind of spreads into other domains. So people feel better, they do more, it kind of feeds on itself. So, and that was kind of scary, because what the regulatory person was saying is that if it bleeds over into these other things, then maybe it's not specific for anhedonia. So then you're stuck, somebody who gets more support because they're going out of the house and they become less anxious because now they have a larger support network, and
they're eating better.
Yeah, they eat, they exercise, and so sleeping better now that you're more active, and so whether how they deal with that, we just don't know. So, but yes, I think we're all in agreement here. That's your question. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Can I make a point, though? It's kind of a summary of, not summary, but reflection of the talk we have had. I mean, do we really want to throw away completely the kind of classification system by diagnosis?
No.
Because
No, we never said that.
But I also think that we kind of forget that there are medications that only works for specific disorder. Like if you give SSRI to a patient with psychosis, psychotic symptoms are not going away. If you give a Spidol to a person with just depressed, you're not going to have an antidepressant effect. So there are some specificity that have also biological underpinning, even if it's just by looking at the fact that they respond to different medication. Again, lithium, maybe is a little bit antidepressant, but definitely, the main effect is in bipolar disorder. So there are some kind of interesting specificity of medication with the classes of disorder that we have. And I wonder whether we should, is there a risk that then we just lose all of that information if we just
Well, I think this is just why I asked this question, because people, and on top of that, people will keep this diagnosis to speak between them. So we need to to suggest a specifier, or we need to have something which is embedded
But it's not only, so there's obviously two issues. One is the clinical use, right? Make sure that everybody who talks about schizophrenia in the US talks about the patient, same patient in Bangkok and same patient in Melbourne. So that's important. But it's also the issue of, if we start saying these are just clinical criteria, they are not, the biological mechanisms are not really diagnostic and they're all just transdiagnostic. I mean, I don't think that's also correct, because dopamine elevation, is only schizophrenia or psychosis, is not in depression, and possibly serotonin reduction is not in schizophrenia. So is that. I'm sorry. Andy, you lost my question. Were you listening to me or were you walking?
Sort of tried to.
Yeah.
And I think you're absolutely correct, because it's like, we have the clean cases that are, that are responding as predicted. It's the dirty cases that are the problem, the ones that we're not able to really classify, and they're not really responding to the medications. Those are the ones that have been struggling.
Yes, but there you also have the combination of two. So, the psychotic depression needs both. So that means that's a different biology than both psychosis alone and depression alone. It's a biology that somehow has something common to the depression and to the psychosis, and it's something that antidepressant has and in dopaminergic antipsychotic tap into it. So there are biological information on, if you give valproate to a psychotic patient, it's not going to become non-psychotic. And all this kind of.
Yeah, but I think the question is really, how are we going to take into account all the information gathered and treatment get created and validated for entities, plus all the new findings and the enrichment? It's not that
Well, I
easy.
mean, we'll always have the chemotherapies.
Exactly.
And we'll always use the chemotherapies. The
cancer.
targeted therapies are exactly really what we're interested in.
Same model than cancer.
Yeah, so we have our high proliferating tumors and our low proliferating tumors, and we have our stromal tumors.
Exactly.
We have the endocrine tumors, and we have to sort of think.
We have radiotherapy and chemotherapy, and we have targeted therapies.
I'm just, I guess the only point I want to make is I'm worried about the message that it may come across, maybe inadvertently from us, that diagnostic categories don't really exist, and in psychiatry there's just all this dimension, because we risk going back to the 60s and 50s, that everybody's got schizophrenia and
right.
Or yes, exactly. Or and so there is a risk, and then you have to think about public opinion. Then we become even less of a kind of a precise science, and we become even more of like mixed bag of people that don't really know. So there are different dimensions all of that. Let's not lose the information we have from the existing treatment, because that tell us something about the diagnosis. Let's not get away with the standardization we've obtained with the DSM-4 and how do we manage to, as you said, put this new information on top of it, but without losing the strength of what we already have.
Yeah, I'm not so concerned about that, because I don't know where else we could go in the near term. We're just starting a new expedition to see how all of these things get together, just as you've described, all these different aspects of the brain, behavior, and so forth. Maybe when we're all pushing up daisies 100 years from now, it will be totally different. But in the near term, no, we have to stay with us and then look at how things spread. If nothing else, we think of these rather than one site, cylinder of steel, and that's the disorder. We're in a broad, messy hilltop that gets out, sort of gets dimmer as it goes out, but it still has some aspects, and we understand that and deal with that. So I'm not so concerned about that. I think one of the things actually for patients is that patients don't like it when they go to 8 psychiatrists and they get 8 different diagnoses, right? So that's another problem. And to the extent that we could say, we're not so worried about your diagnosis, it's closest enough to schizophrenia, but what we can do is that we can actually give you a real treatment that's going to help you. I think that would be much more helpful for them than worrying about, what the diagnosis is.
A real example of like the diagnosis approach restricting is the whole esketamine approval for major depressive disorder with suicidal ideation and behavior. So it works in people with bipolar disorder, right? But you cannot prescribe it to someone who has bipolar disorder and they're suicidal because it's not, it would be off label, right? So I think and the primary outcome there was MADRS, right? Like the study, the phase 3 trials, even though it was recruiting for people with suicidal ideation and behavior. So I mean, there would be like major depressive disorder with insomnia. I think it's going to be the same similar issues. But as a group, I think like as I was reflecting this more, I saw that American Journal of Psychiatry just had another paper from the APA working group on biomarkers saying how like, oh, we had like 7 additional studies, but don't worry, don't do any pharmacogenomic testing. I personally don't order any like pharmacogenomic kits because, we as a field have turned our back on biomarkers again and again, right? And again, we can litigate how useful are those pharmacogenomic kits, right? I mean, I think they're good for predicting side effects. Is that not a worthwhile goal when we have medications that people start and stop using it? I mean, your like the C-reactive protein, I mean, clearly is linked with depression, maybe not the strongest association, but should we not be testing it, right? Like how often do we, like as a field, does APA say that test the thyroid function before starting antidepressant, right?
Sure.
So, I mean, if we are going to do a blood work, I mean, if we are going to draw blood for CBC, TSH, add CRP, right? Like, I mean, yes, it's not going to make the most definitive treatment selection right away, but in the absence of those biomarkers, we will always be like, do an MRI, brain MRI. Yes, we do not have, but now we have good papers showing whether you look at the Nature publication on lifespan trajectories or you look at other papers around brain age. Like, let's start doing some biological measures so that we are not 20 years later talking about how we don't have any measures, right? Like it's the PET for beta amyloid didn't start off with because there was a monoclonal, right? Like that was being developed in parallel as these things are.
But what I was telling you before, because I've been in oncology research, that was my PhD, and I was there at the time they were doing this. And what they did and what we're not doing is, and when I first came to psychiatry, I was like, what are they doing? They're missing the point. So you have your groups, right? CRP, normals, and depressions, and you've got this difference, right? You've got, and the actual patients that are over the controls is really small. Like it's not very many patients. And they're the interesting ones. It's not depression as a whole group. It's the ones that are sticking up over the controls. And so what they do in oncology is they zoom in on those and say, okay, what is it about those that's different from the others? And then they start defining depression with and without CRP over this. And this is starting to come, but psychiatry is a bit slow on, like we go back to the original diagnoses and we don't incorporate this, the markers in a yes/no sort of, and that's what we're missing, I think. And our markers, like our inflammatory markers, don't overlap. If you put them on graphs, like CRP's high in one group, and then you've got IL-12 that's high in another group. It's not the same patients. And so that type of stratification is something we really need to start doing and really isolating the groups that are sticking up convincingly over the controls. And even if it's only 5 patients, we can't clump it together to get better numbers. I think we're missing the game that way.
The CRP in US costs like less than $20. So like we get it on everyone. But I mean, if a fund, like if
you won't get paid.
I don't get paid for anything.
No,
but
paid.
No, I mean, again, it depends. It depends. But if the APA as a positional statement says that like everyone with depression should be getting CRP, right? Like I think that would move the needle, right? Like there are insurance companies in Connecticut that pay for ketamine for treatment-resistant depression. So I think just by saying that they're not going to pay doesn't really like, I mean, if we don't ask for it, of course they won't pay for it, right? Like.
But the difference, I think, is that, you know, with the thyroid hormone, that has always been classically part of the kind of diagnostic assessment or kind of pathophysiological assessment early on, right? And you know that someone has depression, has low thyroid hormones, why you want to normalize it before you treat the depression and see what happens, or you see what happens. But with the CRP, and I know, I mean, I would love to give it to CRP on everybody, but the reality is exactly what is the action point?
We don't always have to jump to that. We gotta like collect it on 100,000 people to say that there are these 3,000 people with high CRP in whom the infliximab monoclonal could be the treatment, except we'll never get to that because we don't measure, right? Like it's a
sourcing study. You could do a crowdsourcing.
Like, I mean, it's that like, oh, NeuroBlue has all these things, and if someone else has these things, I can pull like Epic data anywhere. Like you can do slicer dicer to see what it is. You just won't have a CRP level, except you could have done a slicer dicer in Epic to say everyone with MDD what their CRP level is. We are not talking about like super expensive tests, right? Like these tests are ordered by anyone. And if you like primary cares, like I go to my primary care, I make her order CRP for me.
I do that to all my patients.
Right. So like I mean, so it's I think like as a position we have to say we gotta like start doing measurements without the immediate actionable step. I mean, yes, there is some actionable step, but without in the absence
you start getting data.
Yeah, and then you'll have more like let's start asking for brain MRI.
Cardiovascular disease. I mean, it was like the woman that was presenting on the cancer, that this is a whole process that unfolds and causes inflammation and cardiovascular disease and diabetes. And we know how much depression is connected to all of those different disorders.
So maybe what we should push is to get kind of in the DSM-6 getting up. I mean, I don't know if we're going to get something in the classification, but we could at least have some of the, you know, they have at the end, they have the post categories for future research or something, and say we would like the DSM-6 to endorse, you know, the kind of with the inflammation qualifier across all possible diagnoses, because it could be around for depression, schizophrenia, and so on. And then the DSM-6 recommend to do CRP as a regular test in all patients with psychiatric disorders. And then, you know, as Bruce was saying, in DSM-7, when all of us will be retired, someone will be looking at 100,000, you know, CRP collected, inflammatory markers collected by them, but at least we start, you know.
Yeah, I'm typing.
Manish will. Manish will get
like the BSMIP EEG marker, right? Like why could we not be getting that? Like when we get all types of tests on people, like you, like a med student with overdosing on stimulants presents with psychosis gets $1 million workup, but we can't get an EEG on our patients with psychosis, right? Like
it's an interesting thing. See, Bruce is nodding his head, that maybe there are some measures that could be added.
Not doing anything with it.
As what did you say? How did you say it?
I mean, I don't remember the technical terms for DSM, but they have like a qualifier. So you could
that's what I was saying.
A depression with inflammation, a panic attack with inflammation, PTSD with inflammation, or psychosis with inflammation, or something like this. You know, that. And then it's something that needs to be investigated for.
Yeah, then we could suggest some investigation there.
Severe psychiatric states with suspected somatic engagement and suspected or known, because like I'm having trouble, for example, with bipolar presentations where they have an autoimmune disease, maybe Sjogren's, where the rheumatologists are yawning and said, I had so much dry mouth and dry eyes. But you know, there's quite a few cases now described where the psychiatric state, which is the severe state, is actually responding to immunotherapy, and Sjogren's dementia is a thing. It's described quite well in the 90s. But we need help to get those patients into care, and they're sticking out, and we have no tools for that right now.
We could do something for autoimmune, something because it's called autoimmune psychosis, but it's
severe states with suspected or confirmed somatic comorbidity, something like that, a group where we get mandate to do more.
Or as at least asking to remove the exclusion criteria of somatic comorbid disorders. Something really needed. It's not very dangerous.
Yeah, not make it exclusionary, make it as just something you add as a qualifier or something.
If you go to like
that's a good recommendation.
If you go to like a public mental health in Texas, at least 80% of patients have diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type. Because with that diagnosis, you can prescribe whatever you want. So as a clinician. Like that was like the thing that during training, like this patient after next patient after next patient, it all schizophrenic disorder bipolar type. In epidemiologic studies, there is like very small prevalence, right? But I mean, like we'll have to bridge those gaps also, right? Like if we gave complex disorder diagnoses, then everyone will be that complex disorder,
like
so that I can prescribe whatever I want to prescribe, right? So, because then because Texas was implementing these like medication algorithm projects where you want to match. Yeah, so this so the hangover of that is that clinicians adapted to giving diagnoses, right? That will cover everything, so that you'll never have to justify to a quote unquote bean counter why you're prescribing that, right? So I think we'll have to be careful.
That's part of the problems with our diagnoses, of course, those kinds of issues. I remember years ago, did any of you know Steve Strakowski in Cincinnati? He's a well-known psychiatrist. I remember he came in the early 2000s and he said, you know, it's kind of frustrating. I wanted to look at bipolar people in the Kentucky, Tennessee area and the Appalachian area. And he said, you know, by golly, I found out that there's nobody in those states with bipolar disorder. And we, you know, what he was saying was that there are a lot of people who are Black, of course, there. And when they would come in, they would seem so reticent and worried and paranoid, really, about what that doctor is going to do, that the doctor would say, oh, boy, you're really paranoid, you have schizophrenia. And they would get that disorder rather than bipolar disorder. And that's a real thing, you know, that's something you have to worry about. So those kinds of things really do mess stuff up.
Yeah, we see that in the UK as well.
I'm sure, yeah.
Diagnosed with schizophrenia. And the rest go to jail.
Yeah,
bipolar, you go to jail, we don't see.
There was something in the slides presented on DSM-6 that were talking about DSM-6 incorporating more geographical and cultural things, but I mean, that would be one recommendation, right? Make sure that we don't give different diagnoses of people based on race. So that would be straight.
But they're going to love it. Yes, I don't write.
You don't want to put it in.
No.
Not pretty. All right.
So how do we want to work on that? Anybody interested in trying to, on behalf of ECNP, sort of identify, make proposition?
So what was the expected outcome? I mean, obviously there are practical things like writing a letter to DSM-6 and so on, but in terms of the.
For today?
Well,
I have a slide if you want.
No.
Everything was prepared, so. No, for this meeting, you mean for DSM?
I'm talking about papers or.
Yeah.
What kind of form?
Next step.
So I have a slide with things to discuss.
Okay.
So if you have time, we can discuss that.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
So I gotta go do some shopping.
I'm afraid that I have to sign off also for another meeting that's coming off at 10:30 my time.
Thanks.
So,
Thank you very, very much. Bye,
yes,
Bruce.
thank you very much. Yep, thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks so much for letting me attend this. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce.
Eager to hear the rest. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.